Yeah, following our event last year, where we held a mock court trial, this was very well received and led to requirements for us to do something similar this year. So I'm delighted to welcome back Clyde & Co. We have Alan Henderson, Legal Director, and Samantha Ellaby, Senior Associate of Clyde & Co. International Law Firm, who will be leading this process. Thank you very much indeed, and we very much look forward to it.
Good afternoon. Sorry, we're just sorting out a bit of technology. Okay, welcome to our presentation, which is on workplace health and safety in the UAE. We're hopefully going to try and give you a legal perspective on some of the more prominent health and safety issues that many of you may have experience of or may face on a daily basis. There's quite a lot for us to try and cover if we were to attempt to cover every aspect of health and safety legislation in all of the Emirates, so we're not going to attempt to do that. And I'll start by giving a health warning that this is a high-level overview of some of the key points for you to consider, but certainly we can advise on a whole host of things. In today's session, we're going to give you a very high-level overview of what your obligations are as an employer or as an employee from a health and safety perspective in the UAE, looking at the key labour law obligations and also come on to some of the criminal law obligations that are on employees and organisations. We're then going to have a mock public prosecutor interview process. I think previously you've had experience of a trial. We're not going to do that. We're going to be giving you a live example of a public prosecutor interviewing someone when an incident has happened on a construction site. And then there'll be time for there to be some questions at the end. To start off in terms of who we are, in case you're wondering why we're here, Clyde & Co. is maybe familiar to many of you. It is a global law firm. It's been in the region for over 30 years. We have a whole host of experience in many of the sectors that most of you will operate in, but particularly in terms of health and safety, we have a lot of experience advising clients, principally contractors, when incidents have happened on their construction sites, and we have assisted them in both civil and criminal investigation processes when that has happened. We also have experience advising on health and safety policies and processes that many of you will have in place, and we help to make sure they are current and in line with the current obligations that are on you. So we have a bit of experience and are happy to talk more about that separately after the session. In terms of who we specifically are, as mentioned, I'm Alan Henderson, Legal Director in our Projects and Construction team, so deal directly with contractors in the region facing these problems. And I'll be giving a presentation with Sam Ellaby, who is a Senior Associate in our Employment team and advises clients on the kind of policy training side of health and safety in their organisations. I'm going to hand over to Sam, first of all, who's going to kick off with an overview of what your health and safety obligations are as employers in the region.
Thanks, Alan. So, as Alan mentioned, the main focus of the session today is going to be the mock public prosecutor interview, and that's what we want to allocate the bulk of the time to today. But before we do, we wanted to just give you a brief overview of some of the other health and safety obligations and liability. So how do we know what our health and safety obligations are? Where do we need to look to find out what they are? I suppose, unfortunately for those of us in the room who practice in health and safety, there isn't one single piece or even one primary piece of health and safety legislation. There are numerous pieces of legislation, regulations, guidelines, all of which are relevant from a health and safety perspective. If we go through the list on the slide, Sharia principles and federal legislation will apply to everyone. And as we go through the session, we'll see that Sharia principles do have an impact from a health and safety perspective when we look at things like the Good Samaritan principle, for example. The Penal Code and Civil Code are the two key pieces of legislation that we look to in terms of liability that may arise following a workplace injury. Once we get below that, the rules or the legislation that applies to you will very much depend on where you're based and which sector you're in. So employment legislation, the labour law is the key piece of employment legislation, and that will apply to many of you in the room. But for employers based in the DIFC or in the ADGM, for example, there are a different set of employment rules which have completely different health and safety rules and obligations. For those of you based in the free zones other than the DIFC and ADGM, the labour law will apply, but you will also be subject to free zone rules and regulations, many of which have additional health and safety obligations that you'll need to be aware of. And as we'll see as we go through, there are also some Emirates-specific regulations and sector-specific regulations. So really, in order to understand your obligations in relation to any specific element of health and safety, so your reporting obligations or what you need to do following a workplace injury, you need to work through each of these layers of legislation and rules. The labour law sets out some relatively broadly worded obligations on all employers. So just to pick out a few, employers must provide employees with adequate means of protection against potential workplace hazards. The labour law doesn't go on to say what that protection should look like, and it will obviously depend very much on the nature of your business and the role that the individual is performing. You must display health and safety instructions in a prominent place, and that must be in Arabic and also in any other language or languages that the employees understand. And whilst the labour law doesn't say this, it's also obviously important to think about literacy levels. So it's not just thinking about the language, but also, is written text appropriate at all, or are pictorial instructions more appropriate within your workforce? And you must inform employees of the risks associated with their work, both on commencement of employment and at regular intervals throughout their employment. And again, the labour law doesn't specify how you inform them. That may be in writing, that may be verbally. But one thing that's extremely important, both from a labour law perspective and more broadly when we're looking at health and safety liability, is that you can evidence everything that you've done. So if you do inform employees verbally, you need to make sure that you have a written record of that. Preferably they sign to say that they've received that training or that they've received that information. There are numerous ministerial resolutions that relate to health and safety. The two key ones that we refer to most commonly in our practices are the ministerial resolution which relates to standards of labour accommodation. So there are a couple of ministerial resolutions depending on the size of the business, and they prescribe levels of ventilation, sanitation, drinking water, etc. The other ministerial resolution that we refer to commonly, and it's important to be aware of, is one relating to preventative methods to protect labourers. And in many respects, it restates provisions of the labour law, but it goes into additional detail. So the labour law, for example, requires that employers provide a first aid kit. The ministerial resolution sets out a very detailed list of what that first aid kit should contain. So it's important to read both side by side in order to understand your obligations fully. And then Emirates-specific regulation. Local Order 61 of 1991 is Dubai legislation. It only applies to employers based in Dubai. And it actually contains a really broad spectrum of health and safety obligations, from the duties and responsibilities of health and safety officers through to restrictions on your ability to tamper with or move evidence following a workplace incident without the permission of the police. And then we also have the Dubai Municipality and the OSHAD technical guidelines, which are, I'm sure you're all aware, very comprehensive and very helpful guidelines on health and safety obligations, some of which are general and some of which are sector specific. So in terms of liability, as we've said, we're going to be focusing today on criminal liability, and deliberately so really, because often in the aftermath of a workplace incident, it's the criminal liability that is the key concern, the key focus for companies and for individuals, because it, of course, has the potential to affect someone's liberty. But there are also lots of other types of liability that can and do arise, often concurrently. And they will fall often to different parties. So criminal liability, as we'll see, and as I'm sure you're aware, often falls to an individual. Off the back of a successful criminal finding, we often see civil complaints being brought. The civil complaint can be brought against an individual or a company, but because it's ultimately a claim for compensation, it will commonly be brought against the company. And often it will be the employer of the individual who has been found criminally liable under the vicarious liability provisions. Liability will also arise under the labour law. So as we'll see, there are certain financial obligations and reporting obligations under the labour law, and that will always fall to the employer. So even if your employee has been working on a different site and out of your day-to-day control, any labour law liabilities will always fall to you as their sponsor and their employer. From a contractual perspective, and this is something we're often asked about, it's not possible to contract out of liability for workplace health and safety in the UAE. So provisions in a contract which say, we as the main contractor won't be liable, liability falls solely to you as the subcontractor, won't be enforceable in the event of a dispute. Having said that, it can be helpful, and I certainly would recommend in your contracts that you deal with health and safety where the obligation should fall, thinking about indemnities, etc. But it's important to be aware that you can't simply contract out of your liability. You can enhance the statutory minimum position. So as we'll see as we go through, there are minimum levels of compensation that the law says must be paid, and it's always open to you to enhance that. Where you do, so where you enhance the compensation provisions in the contract, those enhanced compensation levels will apply. So you need to think quite carefully about the extent to which you want the enhancement to apply, the circumstances in which you want it to apply, whether there are any caveats, etc. What is a workplace accident? Doesn't necessarily have a single answer. It will depend on whether we're looking at it from a labour law perspective or a criminal perspective or a civil perspective. From a labour law perspective, it's very clear. The labour law sets out a definition of what a workplace accident or workplace injury is, which is set out on the slide. And as you'll see, it's a pretty broad definition. It includes any injury arising from the employee's work, or as a result of such work, and also on his way to and from work. So if someone has a car accident on Sheikh Zayed Road whilst driving into work, that could still be a workplace injury. We've seen complaints where females have twisted their ankles whilst walking in on their heels. That's still a workplace injury. And a case that we had quite recently, which I think really highlighted to me how broad this definition is where an individual had been sent to the US for work. Whilst he was there, he thought he would make the most of being out there and went on a holiday to South America. Whilst he was flying from South America back to North America for the conference, he was injured, and he claimed that was a workplace injury. When the claim came in to us, we thought, this is extremely far-fetched. Of course, it can't be a workplace injury. He was on a holiday in South America. How can the company possibly have any responsibility for this? We were successful, but not because the court agreed that it was extremely far-fetched, but because the individual had signed his visa cancellation form confirming that he'd received all of his dues, and so the court said he couldn't then claim for anything else. But it was a real eye-opener for our team, I think, in terms of how broad that definition can be. Where an employee sustains an injury or an occupational disease which is set out in the schedules to the labour law, reporting obligations arise. So there's an obligation to report immediately to the police and to the Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratisation. That's purely from a labour law perspective, and there are often much wider reporting obligations, obligations to report in a broader range of circumstances and or to other bodies under some of the other ministerial resolutions or sector-specific resolutions that I've mentioned. There are also a number of financial implications. So firstly, to pay for the employee's medical treatment in a local medical centre until the employee recovers or disability is proven. If the employee is unable to work because of the workplace injury, then there's an obligation to pay their salary for 6 months or until they recover or disability is proven, and then half pay for a further 6 months. And then finally, there's an obligation to pay compensation, and that depends on the injury. There is a schedule to the labour law which sets out the percentage amounts that need to be paid, depending on whether it's a lost limb or loss of sight, for example. But interestingly, it's capped at 24 months basic salary, subject to a minimum of 18,000 and a maximum of 35,000. So even in the case of death or total disability, the maximum compensation from a labour law perspective is 35,000. And for that reason, we often see employees looking to bring civil complaints rather than complaints under the labour law to try and avoid the cap. And there are exemptions, so the financial obligations that I've referred to don't arise in certain circumstances, so where the employee has failed to follow clearly displayed safety instructions, for example. I won't spend too much time on the criminal side of things because we'll pull out many of these points when we get into the public prosecutor interview. But as I'm sure you'll be aware, there is no system of corporate manslaughter in the UAE. So criminal liability following a workplace incident will generally fall to an individual. And that won't necessarily be an individual who has physically caused the incident, but rather the person who is deemed responsible for it. So in our experience, that will often be the safety manager, the site manager, the project manager, for example, someone who's deemed to have responsibility for the site, for the incident. Criminal prosecutions are brought under the Penal Code. 342 relates to death and 343 relates to injury. And as you'll see, there's a minimum penalty of 1 year's imprisonment plus a fine in the case of death, and a maximum of 2 years imprisonment plus a fine of no more than 10,000 dirhams in the case of injury. And then we've included some slides on the Good Samaritan principle because it's something we're increasingly being asked about. There isn't a standalone Good Samaritan law which provides immunity to individuals who administer first aid following a workplace incident. But there are some relevant provisions in the Penal Code and which derive from Sharia law. As I've said on the slide, under the UAE Penal Code, it makes clear that no crime is committed where medical treatment is performed in accordance with generally accepted scientific principles and with the consent, either express or implied, of the individual. And also, both the Penal Code and Sharia principles suggest that an individual may actually be criminally liable if they fail to assist in circumstances where they're able to do so. So what does that mean? Well, if you're not competent, if you're not trained to perform medical treatment, there's certainly no expectation that you will do so, but there is an expectation and a requirement that you take such steps as are within your competency. So that if you're not medically trained, that might simply be calling the medical services and arranging for help, or it might be performing some form of medical treatment in accordance with your competencies. Civil liability, as I've mentioned, that can either fall to an individual or a company, but generally it will be the company. And often that liability will arise either under Article 282, which is very broadly worded and essentially just relates to harm suffered. So that can often be invoked following a workplace injury. Or more commonly, perhaps Article 313, which relates to vicarious liability of employers for acts of their employees, which are done in the course of employment. So as I've said, following a successful finding of criminal liability, often the injured or the deceased estate will then bring a civil complaint against the company saying that you are ultimately responsible for the acts of your employees, so we now want compensation for the injury. And then finally, administrative sanctions. The Ministry of Human Resources and Emiratisation can and do impose fines for breaches of health and safety obligations. And there is a fixed fine of 10,000 dirhams for a number of health and safety breaches, such as failing to report a workplace incident or failing to comply with health and safety standards. So that was a very high-level canter through some of the health and safety obligations, but hopefully it helps just to put it into context. We'll now focus more on the criminal side of things, and Alan's just going to run through the criminal investigation process before we move on to the public prosecutor interview.
Okay, as Sam says, I'm going to just quickly run through the practical process that you can expect if there was to be an incident in your workplace, whether that's a construction site or not, to give you a high-level overview of what the main steps are in that process. Obviously, the process will vary depending on the nature of the accident, whether it's minor, major, or more severe in terms of catastrophes. It will also vary in terms of how it was caused and how many deaths or injuries there have been. So this is a high-level example of what might typically happen, but is certainly not a fixed example of what will definitely happen. So typically where there has been an incident, the first thing that anyone involved in an incident should do is to contact the police, and subject to the severity of the incident, they should also be contacting the Dubai municipality and or the civil defence. The police will typically attend the site and carry out an initial investigation. At that point, if it's a construction site, obviously there are obligations on you in terms of your own organisation to trigger your emergency response protocol, notify insurers, notify senior managers, and obviously clear the site so that there can be no further injuries. When the police are investigating, they will typically want to speak to the people who they consider to be in charge. Often they'll just ask for the supervisor or the project manager, which is why Sam mentioned there that the roles you will typically see being investigated in the first instance is because they're typically understood to be those who have control and management of a site. Some tips in respect of that is that if you are someone who is not present on a site when an incident has happened, but you're notified of it at home, consider whether you wish to return to the site and put yourself in the line of the police who may they subsequently investigate you. That's a call for you morally and from a business perspective to make. Typically the police will take the individuals from the site that they consider are going to be helpful for their investigation. They will take them to the police station and ask them questions. At that point, and once the police have identified who they want to speak to, it's advisable for you to clear the site of any unnecessary personnel and only leave those who are needed to assist with the investigation. If you are someone who's gone to the police station to be investigated, you will typically be asked to explain what happened. At that point, it's important you're only explaining what you can actually recall firsthand because you saw the accident, not handing on information that someone has told you, because that could be mistaken as your evidence because you saw it, and that might not be helpful for you further down the line. You will, if you have information that's considered to be of interest, you may likely have your Emirates ID and or passport taken from you, and that will be held while the police carries out further investigations. You will be most likely released, but your passport will be retained, and you will be asked to sign a statement in Arabic which is what you have told the police when you were there. So it's important that you, if possible, can have your company's PRO and or lawyer attend the police interview with you so that you're aware of what the statement says before you sign it. It's important to know that at the point where the police are doing the initial investigation on site and asking questions of staff, they do not have the power to confiscate property or take documents without permission. So they may likely ask you for information, and they may ask a contractor, for example, to typically submit a list of documents that they think are relevant to the incident, like safety certificates and employment contracts, copies of building permits, and any other number of documents. But they can only ask you to provide them, and you must liaise internally as an organisation as to how you collate those documents and hand them over. Often it's advisable to have, if you are taking legal advice in respect of the incident, to have your lawyers review the documents before you hand them over. Typically, in amongst the documents you'll hand over will be an incident report, and you will no doubt have your own form of incident report that you complete. It is important you review that document before handing it over and ensuring it's very accurate with respect to what actually happened and what caused the accident, and that you're not providing information that might be incorrect to the police when they're doing their investigation. If once the police have concluded their investigations and consider there may be a case to answer because of a failure at some point in your organisation, then the next stage is for the case to be passed to the public prosecutor for further investigation. And we're going to be giving you an example from our experience based on a live example of how those interviews can be conducted. When the public prosecutor is interviewing these members of staff, it's important to know that he is not limited to only those people who sit before him and who were taken by the police at the initial stages of the investigation. The public prosecutor may hear names or have questions and wish to speak to others who were not detained when the incident first happened. So it's important that when you are giving evidence to the prosecutor, you consider what you tell him, you understand factually what happened, and you tread carefully before naming other people's names if that might not be something that you actually have to do. He also has discretion to ask for more documents and to send the police or the Dubai Municipality engineer to the site to carry out further investigations. That process can take anywhere between 1 month to 6 months in our experience, or it can take longer in many instances. The public prosecutor is trying to get to the bottom of how the accident happened. He's not setting out to prosecute someone for no reason. He's genuinely interested in identifying that there has been a problem, that there may have been a health and safety failing, and ensuring that someone is prosecuted so that it doesn't happen again. Unfortunately for the legal system here, that means criminal prosecutions against individuals rather than civil prosecutions in the first instance against an organisation. And many of you might be familiar with the concept of corporate manslaughter in other jurisdictions, which does not exist here. So as an employer, it will be your staff members who will be personally criminally prosecuted for the death or injury of someone on a construction site or in a workplace. And that's why the manner in which you conduct yourself in these investigations is very important. We are going to, as I say, run through an example of a public prosecutor interview, and that will hopefully highlight for you the benefits of giving serious attention to how you conduct yourself when being interviewed, what information you hand over to a public prosecutor, and what information you do not. By no means are we suggesting and giving you an example of how to conduct yourself that you lie or withhold information that will be helpful, because ultimately what you're trying to do is assist the authorities to investigate an accident that has occurred, and it's occurred for a reason, because there may have been a failing. However, if it is a case where it's happened because it genuinely was an accident, then you want to be careful that you're not suggesting information that might not be correct and might make the prosecutor believe there has been a failing that there has not been. If the public prosecutor believes that there is a case to answer and that any of the individuals before him should be prosecuted under Article 342 or 343, he will refer the case to the criminal court of first instance. That is a court which has one judge, and in that case, at that point, your employer and or you personally should ensure you are represented by a lawyer. That lawyer will need a power of attorney to be authorised to act on your behalf. And when you come to the case, you will be asked to submit a written defence in which you'll have to explain to the prosecutor why it is that you are not personally liable for the death or the injury of the person that you're being charged with having caused. The case against you will be the content of the public prosecutor's file. which will be all the documents you have given him and which will be all the statements you or any witnesses have given him, which is why it's exceptionally important, as we've mentioned already, that you and others conduct themselves correctly during the investigation process, because it's your own documents that will be used to prosecute you. So it's important you're very clear on what information you're handing over. Once you get the decision from the Court of First Instance judge, you might not be happy with that, and the public prosecutor might not be happy with it. Either or both of you have the right to appeal to the Court of Appeal, which is almost invariably happens. Typically, the public prosecutor will not be happy if it's a lower conviction, like an acquitted sentence or a suspended sentence, so you will typically appeal. You'll end up in the Court of Appeal before 3 judges, and then again, you will submit a written appeal document as to why the case against you is wrong. Subject to the outcome of the Court of Appeal, if you're still not happy, you have the option to appeal to the highest court in Dubai, which is the Court of Cassation, and that needs to be on a point of law. So at that point, no longer will it be relevant to say the facts are incorrect. You have to be relying on an error in law that the prosecutor or the judge has made. So the court process can take a number of years, and one of the key factors in how long the court process lasts is the medical condition of those who are injured. If there is deaths, then obviously it can move a bit quicker because you don't need to wait on medical reports. But if there are injuries, the police will not pass a police investigation file to the public prosecutor for further investigation until the police forensic department determine that the individual who has been injured is in what's regarded as a stable condition. And he will rely on a report from the hospital and from the forensic department to conclude that that person is stable. That can take a number of years if the person has severe injuries and is having repetitive surgeries. And for all the while, the individuals who had had their passports taken at the initial stages of the investigation will still have their passports surrendered. And we have had cases where that has lasted in excess of 2 or 4 years. So again, that reinforces the point as to why it's very important when an investigation is begun to an incident that you make sure the correct people are on site and or are not on site, and that you only volunteer information if you can actually truthfully speak to that information because of your involvement in that incident. Broadly speaking, there are some key points on the slide that are maybe difficult to read about the criminal court proceedings that are important to note. They are all conducted in Arabic, so you will need an Arabic-speaking lawyer. Samantha and I are not entitled to appear in a Dubai court. It has to be a locally registered advocate. So if we were instructed, we have advocates who act on our behalf. There is very minimal opportunity for any oral submissions. So it's not like you see on the TV. You don't typically call witnesses. You don't stand up and present your case. You turn up and hand over a document and then you walk away. And the hearing lasts about 10 seconds. So don't have an expectation that there's some fancy, glamorous process. It's not. It's very much down to the quality of the written submissions that you make. And that's why it's important, again, that the documents you hand over and the lawyers that you instruct to represent you are capable of sufficiently doing so. Very rarely will they call witnesses to give evidence. That can often happen where you might submit in your defence that the Dubai municipality engineer has made a mistake or hasn't understood the complexities of the construction project and therefore hasn't understood why the accident happened. That does happen, and so the court may wish to call the engineer to ask him questions as to why he has concluded that something happened if we are saying that's not what happened. So there is an opportunity for some witness evidence, but it's very minimal. Also, keep in mind that there is no binding system of precedent in the UAE, which is very unfamiliar compared to the UK or Australia or other jurisdictions. So how one case is decided does not dictate how the next case will be decided. And I have not come across any case which has been decided in the same way based on the same facts. So keep in mind that just because your lawyers are lawyers, they can't guarantee what will happen because it's down to the prosecutor, it's down to the judge, it's down to the evidence that the prosecutor has in front of him, and that does vary from case to case, unfortunately. So that's hopefully a very high-level summary for you of the process, not intended to intimidate or scare you, but it is a reality, and it's a reality we have to be aware of. So what we're going to run through now is a very quick example of how a public prosecutor will interview someone when he has been presented to him from an incident. This is an incident which is broadly based on a real case, but obviously has been changed. The content of the interviews that we will do are also broadly based on live witness statements that we have from cases. So they may seem short, they may seem brief, the public prosecutor may seem very direct, but that is the reality of how we have seen these interviews be conducted. So we're putting it together in this way so you get a very real example of what it's like. Do keep in mind, as I've said on multiple occasions, it's not a set way of doing things. Every prosecutor is different. The approach to interviews is done differently, but this is to give you a flavour of how it's done. The idea is that we want to be very interactive with you, so once one interview is done, we will be opening it to the floor for any observations on how you think that interview went, whether you think it could have been done better, not based on their acting skills, but based on whether they've said things you don't think they should have said, and then we'll run it again. So it's going to be a very interactive session, so if you're not up for that, you should probably leave now, and hopefully no one's going to leave. The scenario for you to keep in mind in the background, I'm going to skim through it, I'm not going to read it all out, but there is a scenario. The scenario is that there is a developer who has appointed Clyde Construction, and just to clarify, we do not have a construction company as an offshoot of our law firm. It was constructing a project in Dubai and it had 3 phases. Then there were 3 distinct phases. One phase was progressing initially, phase 1, but phase 1 had to stop for a number of reasons. Because phase 1 stopped, the contractor had to close phase 1 of the site and not allow anyone to enter that part of the site, and they proceeded with phase 2. Unfortunately, on the 1st of August, an individual called Renjith, who was a labourer employed by Clyde Construction, entered into phase 1 when the security was changing shifts, so no one noticed he had done so. He went and slept in a shaded area that had been partially erected by the contractor. Renjith, unfortunately, was not aware that he was sleeping beside a temporary access point to a 6-metre deep underground pump room, and it wasn't indicated in signage. There was no appropriate safety signage, and he inadvertently fell through that access point. He wasn't wearing a helmet or PPE because he was on a break and he'd gone for a sleep. On a routine inspection at 7:30, so this is now 6 hours later, security found Renjith's body and he is deceased. He had, however, not died on impact, but died as a result of his injuries and lying there for 6 hours. The Dubai Police and Dubai Municipality called to the site. They carried out their investigation. The employer enacted its emergency response protocol, and all senior managers were notified. There are 2 individuals who are being spoken to by the police. We have Will Cadwallader, who's sitting at the table. He was the project manager. He finished his shift at 7 p.m. and so was not on site when the body was found, but he returned immediately when someone called him. And then we have Dan, who was the supervisor responsible for phase 2 of the works, and he was on a 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. shift that day, and he was still on site when the body was found. The police asked to speak to both of them. They've been spoken to, and the case has been passed to the public prosecutor. Other members of staff have named both of them as people who are responsible for the site and therefore responsible for the death of Renjith. So they're entering their public prosecutor interview. Some key points to note is that the Dubai Municipality engineer determined that there were 3 causes of the death of Renjith. Those causes were that Clyde Construction had no strict supervisory control to ensure that individuals did not enter the phase 1 sites, that Clyde had inadequate measures in place by way of signage to prevent people from entering that phase of the site, and that Clyde lacked control generally of the location of its labourers on site. And they were the 3 reasons the Dubai Municipality engineer determined caused the incident. And so, as I've said, because of that, the prosecutor wants to interview Will as the project manager and Dan as the supervisor. They would be accompanied by the lawyers if they had contacted us, but they didn't, so they're there on their own, which you'll hopefully see is a bad move. So before we skip on to, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Roya, who is the public prosecutor, to interview Will, and once she has done that, I'm going to ask the floor for their observations on that interview. So Will is the project manager, and the prosecutor wants to speak to him.
Good afternoon.
Can you please tell me what is your name?
It's Will Cadwallader.
And how old are you?
I'm 34.
Where is it that you live?
Burdaby?
Whereabouts in Burdaby?
Sorry, Glacier Tower. It's flat number 604.
Who is it that you work for?
I work for the main contractor. It's Clyde Construction LLC.
Right. And what is your job title exactly?
I'm the project manager for the project.
So tell me, what is it that happened on site exactly?
There's been an incident. It happened back in August, so I've been told. I think it was the 1st of August. One of the labourers, Renjith, fell asleep during one of his breaks in an area that he shouldn't have been in, and unfortunately fell down a 6 metre deep underground pump room, the access point to that. I've been told that he wasn't wearing any equipment, and apparently the area wasn't being supervised at the time.
So you're responsible for causing the death of Renjith, aren't you?
I am project manager of the site. I am ultimately responsible, I guess, for everyone who's on the site, yes.
I have the DM engineer's report in front of me, and he's concluded that Renjith died because there was a lack of control of the location of the labourers. Now, as project manager, you're responsible for that, aren't you?
I guess I am. And as I said, I'm responsible for what happens on the site, and there wasn't any supervision or tape or anything like that. So. Yeah.
What's your relationship with a Dan Robinson?
Dan, he's a supervisor on the site.
So he's also responsible for the death of Renjith Jamin, isn't he?
As a supervisor, he is responsible for supervising all the labourers and what they do on a daily basis. So I guess he is partially, yeah.
The DM engineers also concluded that Renjith died because there was a lack of supervision. Now, Dan's responsible for that, isn't he?
Well, as I said, yeah, he is the supervisor, and I've been told that there weren't adequate safety provisions in place. So if that's what the engineer is saying, I guess it must be true. Yeah, Dan must be responsible.
Okay, so that's the end of that interview. That's as far as it would go. And then Will would be asked to sign a statement in Arabic, because the interview would have been conducted in Arabic, and he would have had a translator, and the questions would have gone through the translator. So before we kind of put up on the screen a couple of observations, does anyone have any observations of their own as to how they think that interview went for Will? Do we think he's going to be prosecuted or not, based on what he has said?
The project manager replies that ultimately I am responsible. This is what my observation is, that he should not tell like this, that ultimately, yeah, he is ultimate responsible, but that this statement should be more clear. This is what I observe.
Yeah, that's spot on, yeah. So one of the main observations you'll have is that he effectively accepted responsibility. He didn't push the prosecutor for clarity on what he meant in his question, and he didn't decline to say that he was responsible. The key things that I'll put that are on the slide is that at no point did Will mention he was not on site when the incident happened, and factually he was not there. So he should be making it very clear that he was not there and therefore has no first-hand experience or knowledge of that incident. He at no point explains what his role as project manager is, which any project manager in the room will know is not to be responsible for the location of a labourer on a construction site. You have a management role and you report to a client. As I say, he wasn't present, so how can he explain how he knows how Renjith died? Because he wasn't there. Nobody was there when Renjith died, so nobody knows how he died. They just found him in a hole. He accepts responsibility by saying he was responsible as project manager. He also throws Dan under the bus by saying that Dan is a supervisor and he's also responsible for the death of Renjith. So all in all, a pretty bad interview from Will, but not an uncommon one, because in that scenario, he's a bit daunted by the experience. He isn't sure what he should or shouldn't say. He might not have the confidence to say to the prosecutor, can you repeat the question? Can you clarify what you mean? Or he might not have the confidence to say no or I don't know, which is what he should do. Also, what you might notice is at the very beginning, after Roya asked how the incident happened, she didn't ask Will whether he was responsible. She told him that he was responsible. And that's common, particularly when it comes from a prosecutor through a translator. It's not a question, it's him telling you that you did it. And that often catches many people who are being interviewed off guard because they don't know how to respond to that. And having the confidence to say, no, I didn't, is actually something that's difficult for many to do. So that's an example of how Will has now set himself up for being sent off to court. Now Dan's going to jump in and give you an example of how he will be interviewed as the supervisor.
Hello.
Hi,
Can you please tell me what is your name?
Dan Robinson.
And how old are you?
I'm 38.
Where is it that you live?
Dubai.
Whereabouts in Dubai?
I live in Karama, Building 6, flat 39.
Who is it that you work for?
I work for Clyde Construction, LLC.
And what do you do there? What's your job title?
I'm the supervisor.
What is it that happened on site that day?
Ranjith was on was found dead. I was told he was found dead. He'd fallen down a hole, and he'd died. I think he'd gone to sleep in an area he shouldn't have been.
So you're responsible for causing the death of Ranjith, aren't you?
I'm the supervisor, so it must be my fault if someone dies.
Now, I have the DM report in front of me, and the engineers concluded that Ranjith died because of a lack of supervision. Now, you failed to adequately supervise Ranjith, didn't you?
As supervisor, I must ensure that the labourers and staff are in their designated areas performing the work that's assigned to them. Ranjith was not where he should have been, and I'm responsible for that.
Now, the DM engineer has also concluded that Ranjith died because of a lack of signage deterring people from entering into the Phase 1 site area. You are responsible for that.
Again, as supervisor, it's my role to ensure the labourers don't go where they should not. The signage was obviously not enough to deter Ranjith, and I'm responsible for that.
Now, the engineers also concluded that Ranjith died because of a lack of control of where the labourers were on site. You're responsible for that, aren't you?
As supervisor, it's my job to know where all the labourers are and what they're doing. I didn't know where Ranjith was. I didn't know he had entered the Phase 1 area.
Tell me, what is your relationship with Will Cadwallader?
Will's the project manager. He has overall responsibility for the site.
So therefore, Will is also responsible for the death of Ranjith, isn't he?
Well, he has overall responsibility for what happens at site, so yes.
So it's Will who's also responsible for the lack of signage deterring people from entering into the Phase 1 area.
Well, the project manager's responsible for the site, so he's responsible for making sure I'm doing my job. If there's anything, if there are any inadequate signage, then he's also responsible.
So Will would also be responsible for the lack of control of the labourers and where it is that they are positioned on site, isn't he?
As I said, as project manager, Will has overall responsibility for the site. So knowing where people are working, etc., that's yeah, especially if there is an area that no one should be allowed to enter.
Consequently, Will would also be responsible for your lack of supervision, wouldn't he?
I report to Will. If I'm not doing my job correctly, it's his job to tell me.
Thank you.
So what do we think about how Dan did? Any better than Will? Any observations?
Thank you. If, after all, as a human being, there is a possibility of negative behavior. if any accident happen, it's more contribution goes to his behavior. Is there any reduction in compensation or relief in punishment or not?
So was that a question about... I didn't catch all of it, I'm afraid.
I said if it's poor performance, negative behavior is possible by the employee. If any accident happen, not death, injury or death, in such case, is there any reduction in compensation amount or relief in punishment?
Okay. Do you mind, we will leave time for questions at the end, but perhaps if we could just run through the scenario now, and we'll have about 10-15 minutes at the end to run through any questions.
Thank you.
So does anyone have any observations on Dan's interview? Do we think he did well?
No. It looks like Dan and Will are going down together.
Yes.
My question is, well, it's an observation question. If I am Dan or Will, but I respond in what I hope you're about to show us next, how do I get out of the fact that somebody else has already, as you say, thrown me under the bus?
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely right, that you can do your bit perfectly, but if someone else is throwing you under the bus, then that's not going to be helpful. And I suppose that's where training your employees, having an emergency response procedure in place so that you have the right people are going to be interviewed by the police, and those people know what to expect, what they should and shouldn't be saying, so that when they get into this situation, they're not then throwing people under the bus and admitting responsibility when that's not correct.
And I think it highlights the importance of, as an organisation, being very alive to the reality of what happens when an incident happens. If the public prosecutor is going to call people for an interview, then he will have his clerk call them all at once on the same day, typically. So you will each know if you're being called for an interview. You should always buy yourself some time and say you're not available, you'll come in 2 days or 3 days, which you can do. And you speak to your HR team, your internal health and safety team, if possible the lawyers who your company are instructing, and you are briefed on how to conduct yourself in an interview, and briefed collectively and separately so that you are not saying something that will harm someone else. Of course, incident happened for a reason, so you can't entirely avoid saying what happened. If you need to mention other people, you need to mention other people. You can't avoid that in some instances, so we're not trying to coach you or tell you how to avoid saying something, but it's about how you convey the story and facts in a way that doesn't necessarily make life difficult for someone or any more difficult than it needs to be. Fundamentally, there are cases where someone is to blame and where an individual has given an instruction or done something that they should not have done, and it's difficult for someone else who's been called in to not want to get out of it themselves by blaming someone else. And unfortunately, sometimes you have to do that, but that's not wrong. There's a way to do it, and you need to hope that the other person likes you. I think is the short answer. So
Dan didn't do a great job of the interview. Similar to Will, he accepted responsibility. And whilst I think when you watch it in this scenario, you think, well, why would you do that? Actually, it's extremely common because someone's just died on your site, and whilst you may not, you accept that you didn't actually cause the injury or the fatality, often you will feel a moral responsibility, and I think that's really what Dan was trying to say, but obviously didn't articulate that particularly well, and will have left the public prosecutor with a statement that says, I'm responsible for that incident. He agrees with the DM engineer's conclusions. He doesn't challenge them at all or try and explain them and put them into context. And again, he very much blames Will, without giving any explanation as to what their respective roles were. And also, we focused on what Dan and Will have said, but also, what about, not so much about what Dan said, but how he said it. He was very slouched forward. The body language wasn't particularly strong. He wasn't making eye contact. All of those things also make a difference when you get to the public prosecutor interview. So let's do it again and let's have a look both at what they say, but how they say it and what their body language is like. And let's see if we think they do a better job this time.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Can you please tell me what is your name?
It's Will Cadwallader.
And how old are you?
I'm 34.
Whereabouts in Dubai do you live?
I live in Bur Dubai, which in the Glacier Tower, flat number 604.
Who is it that you work for?
I work for the main contractor on the site, Clyde Construction LLC.
And what is your job title?
I'm the project manager for the entire site.
Tell me, what happened on site that day exactly?
Well, I'm aware there's been a fatality on the site, but I can't tell you any more. I don't know any more about it.
You're responsible for causing the death of Ranjith Jamin, aren't you?
No, I'm not. I was not on the site when it happened. I'm not responsible for the specific work that labourers carry out.
I have the DM report in front of me, and the engineers concluded that Ranjith died because there was a lack of supervision and control over the location of the labourers whilst on site. Now, as the project manager, you're responsible for that.
No, I'm not.
So explain what it is that your role involves exactly.
Well, as the project manager, I have two main roles on the site. The first is to report back to the management of the company as to how we're getting on, the progress, whether we're on time, are we on budget, and for that reason, I actually spend a lot of my time in the head office. The second role that I have is that I manage the teams of QSs, quantity surveyors, the programmers and designers on site. You know, clients have a number of teams with different skills, and they're all performing different roles and different aspects of the work. So they report to me, so I can then report to the management. But I don't deal with any of the labourers on the site, what they do or where they are on a day-to-day basis.
Are you actually telling me that on a day-to-day basis you don't know what's going on your site?
Well, no, I do know what's going on because other managers report to me. But my role, it doesn't involve deciding where the labourers should be located, and I don't make any decisions about the specifics of the works.
Right. So tell me, what's your relationship with Dan Robinson?
Dan's he's the supervisor of the site.
So as supervisor, he's also responsible for the death of Ranjith, isn't he?
I don't know.
What does Dan's role involve?
Well, as a supervisor, Dan ensures that the labourers are working where they're supposed to be, and that they're in the correct locations on site on a daily basis.
Now, the DM engineer has also concluded that Ranjith died because of a lack of supervision regarding the signage, preventing people from entering into the Phase 1 area. Dan's responsible for that, isn't he?
I don't know, again.
Well, if there's a lack of supervision and Dan is the supervisor, then Dan must be responsible.
Again, I can't answer that question. I don't know.
You're a project manager. How can you not know what's going on your site? Or who's responsible for this incident?
Well, firstly, as I said, I wasn't on site when it happened. I'd already left for the day. Secondly, I'm not responsible for the day-to-day management of the labourers or where they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to be doing. And thirdly, as a company, we have a risk management and method statement. It sets out the rules, it sets out what people should be doing on site on a daily basis. And I know that this was followed when we stopped working on the Phase 1 part of the works. And I know for a fact that all the labourers were told about that.
So answer me this. If you're not responsible for the death of Ranjith, then who is?
I don't know. I wasn't there. But, you know, the deceased I do know the deceased should not have been where he was. when the incident happened.
Okay, so first of all, before we focus on Will, if you maybe focus on the prosecutor, you'll notice in this scenario the prosecutor was becoming more frustrated because, and I've sat in on cases where the prosecutor is exceptionally frustrated because he often has people before him who have nothing to do with the incident, and there has been a perhaps mistake along the way with that person being put in front of him, and he does become frustrated because ultimately his job is to understand why the incident happened. He wants people in front of him who can help him understand that. So if the police put someone in front of him who doesn't know anything about it because he wasn't there, he will become agitated and frustrated, and I've seen him throw people out of an interview because he's been fed up with the whole process, and that unfortunately is what happens. In this case, you'll see Will made the prosecutor work a bit harder to understand what happened. He didn't just volunteer information without being asked, and she had to do more of the work than he did. Broadly speaking, though, what he did do well was make it very clear that he was not there when the incident happened, and therefore that he could not know what happened. He didn't blame someone else. He said that he did not know, because how can Will as an individual know whether legally someone is responsible for that person's death? He's not a lawyer, he's not a prosecutor. The answer should always be, I don't know, because he cannot know. And he also makes it very clear in the evidence that he gives that he knows his role well, he knows how his site works, he confirms there are policies in place and that all labourers were briefed on those policies. And to an extent, he blames the deceased. And morally, people don't like doing that, but that's okay. If the deceased should not have been where he should have been and it's his fault, then blame the deceased because it's his fault. And Will did that at the end, and that's okay because it's either that or you go to jail. So morals might not come into it, unfortunately, in that situation. So that's Will having done a much better job, and as I say, this is based on a real-life example, and that is the type of evidence that Will gave, not personally, but his character gave, and it wasn't subsequently passed to the public prosecutor. In the evidence he gave the first time, it was passed to the court. So it's a very real example of the questions he was asked, the answers that he gave, and how that passed on to the court or not. And now Dan's going to have another shot at being better than he was the first time.
Hello.
Hi,
Can you please tell me what is your name?
Dan Robinson.
And how old are you?
I'm 38.
Whereabouts do you live?
I live in Karama, Building 6, flat 1308.
Who is it that you work for?
I work for Clyde Construct LLC.
And what do you do? What's your job title?
I'm the supervisor.
So tell me, what happened exactly?
So I was made aware that one of the labourers had died. I myself was not the scene of the incident, but I was on site. I can't help you anymore, I'm afraid. I don't know anymore.
But you're responsible for causing the death of Renjith Jayaman, aren't you?
No, I'm not.
Now, I've got the DM report in front of me, and the engineers concluded that Renjith died because of a lack of supervision. Now, you are the supervisor, correct? You failed to therefore adequately supervise Renjith, didn't you?
No, I did not. Renjith is assigned to an area in Phase 2 that day, and he did not attend that area, despite being instructed to do so.
The DM engineers also concluded that Renjith died because of a lack of signage, deterring people from actually entering into the area. As the supervisor, you are responsible for that, aren't you?
No, I'm not. Everything that could be done to stop people entering the Phase 1 area was done. Clyde complied with its risk assessment and method statement. Renjith was trained in workplace health and safety. He was told not to enter the Phase 1 site. He did so nonetheless and is responsible for his own death.
Now, the engineers also concluded that he died because there was a lack of control of where the labourers were on site. You were responsible for that.
Again, no, I'm not. As I said, Renjith failed to comply with his instructions and chose himself to enter the Phase 1 area. He's responsible for his own death.
Right. So what is it that your role of a supervisor entails exactly?
So I manage teams on site. I allocate make sure they're allocated to appropriate workstations each day. They report to me on progress, and I in turn report to management. I'm not directly responsible for safety on site.
What's your relationship like with Will Cadwallader?
He's the project manager for this project.
So therefore he's also responsible for the death of Renjith, isn't he?
No. As project manager, he does not manage or control the labourers.
Will is also responsible for the lack of signage then, deterring people into entering the phase 1 area, isn't he?
No. This is not within his role.
So then Will is responsible for the lack of control of the labourers and where they were on site, isn't he?
No. Again, as I said, this is not within his role.
Tell me, Will is also responsible for your lack of supervision, isn't he?
No. I carried out my role correctly. The works were supervised.
Well then, if you're not responsible for Renjith's death, and Will's not responsible for Renjith's death, who is?
I don't know.
So do we think Dan did a better job this time? Yeah. I mean, even just, you could tell he was much more confident. He was sat up straight, he was speaking very clearly. It just came across as a much more confident interview, at the very least, I think. He also, he was clear on what his role was and the fact that he wasn't responsible. He understood Will's role and was able to explain how Will's role fitted into the scenario. He doesn't blame others. He genuinely says that he doesn't know who's responsible. He wasn't there at the time. Yeah, so I mean, overall, a much stronger interview. So that concludes the public prosecutor interview, and we've got some time left for questions. So does anyone have any questions either about the interview or about health and safety laws and obligations generally?
I think if we just answer quickly the question that I think was asked earlier. The question that was asked earlier was about perception, I think, in the interview. If you are slouching or sitting upright, and how do you answer questions? I think it's what the gentleman asked, and I think what we're saying is that it does help you to be holding yourself up in an authoritative way as someone who knows what they're talking about and who comes across well, but principally as someone who is showing respect to the office of the person that you're sitting in, who holds a great deal of power and who is someone to be respected. And it's about demonstrating that towards him more than anything. It's not if you wear a suit and speak politely, you'll get off, and if you don't, you won't. It's not that. It's about having respect for the process, and respect for the public prosecutor is the main thing about perception. But any other questions, sorry?
Good afternoon, my name is Sajid Mohammed, and the question I wanted to ask was based on the scenario which we saw here due to the death of Ranjith. We saw that we were explaining to the judge, to the prosecution and all, saying that we did conduct training and we informed Ranjith that this is the area that they shouldn't have been resting or whatever. But in such scenarios, is it important that you are required to take any sort of acknowledgement from Ranjith or any other staff that the risks have been identified and all? Because different companies, different processes, different procedures. For example, in our company, we are using an e-learning module where we actually communicate all such information via e-learning platform. So in such scenarios, how do HSE professionals can defend themselves? Because I just want to know, can we be tried in the court and all in such cases that, okay, it was just an information that was passed, but we haven't checked whether they have understood or not? Thank you.
So I mentioned during the presentation, one of the first things that the Dubai Municipality Engineer does when there's been an incident is he gives a list of documents that he wants the contractor to provide, and that includes an incident report and a number of other documents. It often includes safety documents to show that there are safety policies in place, there are risk assessments, method statements, that the individuals were trained to use the equipment they were using when the incident happened, etc., etc. So there's an opportunity at that point for an employer to hand over the relevant documents and to include as much as you think you need to include under the category that he's asked for to show that the people were trained properly. The reason for that is because when that initial investigation is done, the police will decide there and then whether it should go to the public prosecutor or not, and if he's satisfied that it genuinely was an accident, that everybody was sufficiently trained and there were sufficient policies, then he won't pass it to the prosecutor and nothing will happen, and we've seen those cases. If it gets to the point of being in front of a public prosecutor, typically he won't take documents from you when he's interviewing you because he's got the file in front of him and he's running that interview. So if you go in and try and throw things in front of him, it doesn't usually go down too well. But if you subsequently end up at court, when you write your written defence, you can submit with your written defence more evidence of compliance with safety, and that will be reviewed by the judge. So there are opportunities in the process to hand over the documents that you maintain to demonstrate you've discharged the obligation on you to comply with safety policies and make sure people are adequately trained. So there are opportunities to do that, and so that's a good question because it highlights the importance of keeping regular training sessions, making sure staff are trained regularly, that toolbox things are done, that regular training sessions are held and everyone's certificates are up to date, because it's often when an incident happens and I say, where are all the safety records for that person, that you realise they're not there, or they were last trained 4 years ago when they had their first induction, and that highlights the importance of making sure that's done regularly.
Hello, hi, myself Abbas. One question, why safety officer are accountable for all accidents? Every time safety officer is accountable.
In my experience, we've got on the slide.
Whereas regulation says safety advisor is just an advisor to the company, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, so in my experience, what we put on the slide, and this is only based on our experience of clients who have come to us, typically when the police are investigating an incident, you notionally think of an accident and safety, so you put the two and two together, you think, well, if there's been an accident, I want to speak to the safety officer. So in our experience, it's because from day one, when an incident first happens, the police ask to speak to a safety officer, and so that's the first person who's put in front of them. It makes sense to think if a company has a policy, the safety officer is administering it, and if it's not being administered, then he's responsible for the accident, and that's, I think, how it ends up like that.
But we have legal regulations that clearly mention advisor are not responsible for any accidents.
Yeah, but we're talking about a criminal investigation process, which is distinct to that. That's the difference. This is a criminal investigation process by the police. That's standalone to your civil obligations and regulations telling you who is to do what and what officers you have to have. That's separate. A criminal investigation, the police can arrest anyone they want. And as I'm saying, because of their experience in safety issues, they will typically ask for supervisor, safety officer, and that's not necessarily a problem because the onus is then on those people to demonstrate they're not responsible. So you've got an opportunity to demonstrate that at a later point. But in short, there's no specific reason why they're not obliged to arrest a safety officer. They just happen to ask a safety officer because they think he'll know the answers, I think is the reason.
Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Faisal. I have just one question related to the legal compliance. If I'm a process owner and I'm just going to hire some contractor to work in my area, and contractor, he has his own rules, regulation, procedure, and somebody got injured due to his work. So still I'll be liable for that person, or that company which I'm hiring, he will be liable for that person.
I guess it comes back to the slide where it set out the different types of liability. Criminal liability could still fall to you, someone within your company, and we've seen cases where that has happened, even where you've brought a subcontractor in and you've said you're responsible for the health and safety, you have to deal with this. We've still seen instances where a manager from the main contractor has been found criminally liable. Labour law responsibilities, that wouldn't arise because they're not your employee. Civil liability could still arise for the company if one of your employees is found criminally liable. So yes is the short answer. Even where it's not your employee, it's a subcontractor, you could still
We've actually had cases in the very same scenario, and the employer, so you in that scenario, the safety officer of your company was the one who was arrested, and the charges were a failure to get a work permit for the company you hired in, or a failure to get no objections to those people coming in. And that was a scenario where you had got a main contractor and then a subcontractor, and the subcontractor had the accident, but the employer's staff were prosecuted. So the point Sam makes is that the police will come in and investigate. To them, at that point, the hierarchy of employer, developer, main contractor, subcontractor, supplier, consultant, none of that means anything to them. They're just in to find out, how did this accident happen, who's in charge, who's the safety officer, and that's how it starts. So you're not hidden by the fact that you're the person who brought them in to do something on your facility or to use your facility, because it's a criminal investigation and they want to get to the bottom of how it happened. And mistakes are made along the way. They often do interview the wrong people first. And that's why it's important you conduct yourself correctly and make very clear during any interviews that you give who you are, what you know, what you don't know, why you don't know that, and explain that the trail of all the different organisations and how they're linked to one another. Explain that as clearly as you can from the beginning to get yourself out of that situation. But in short, you're not going to escape prosecution in that scenario just because of who you are.
I have, first of all, thank you very much for this wonderful session. We have learned a lot, and thanks for asking question about observations. DEM has said that I am not responsible for safety, which leads to another question, then who is responsible for safety? And this type of question shall be given by DAM. It's not in this, DAM as example. That is one my question. The second thing, can DM report be challenged in front of prosecutor? Because prosecutor is asking to DAM that lack of control, lack of this. So if DAM is rejecting that, then somebody has signed the DM report.
Yeah. So in answer to your, I'll take that question first because it's the most fresh, which is, I think you're basically saying,
DAM has
can the
said,
witness challenge the Dubai Municipality Engineer's conclusions?
No, I will repeat again. DAM, while replying to prosecutor, he said, I am not responsible for safety, which gives an opportunity to prosecutor, then who is responsible for safety? So that is directly means DAM as a supervisor is getting out and health and safety officer is coming in.
Well, it's for the prosecutor.
This is my perception.
Yeah, so it's for the prosecutor in that scenario to do some work. The prosecutor then needs to find out who's responsible. If he's got people sitting in front of him who say, no, it wasn't me, I don't know, he can acquit them, or he can send them to court because he's lazy and he doesn't want to do any more work, is one option. Or he can say, okay, well, I want to go back to the police and I want to ask more questions and I want to find out more about who is involved and I want to push the witness to tell me who is the safety officer, who is the safety manager, who is this person. So it's very much in the hands of the prosecutor at that point as to what he does. But in short, yes, if the witness in front of him is saying, I don't know, and I wasn't there and I'm not responsible for safety, it's the prosecutor's job to find out who was. And he can ask those questions. And if he asks you who's the safety officer, you'll have to tell him who the safety officer is. And it's for him to then go and interview him.
Thank you. And that second, can DM report be challenged in front of prosecutor?
Yeah, so in that scenario, what the prosecutor is doing is the case against those he's interviewing is the prosecutor, the engineer's report. That's all that he's got because the prosecutor hasn't been there, he hasn't been to the site, he hasn't done his own investigation yet. So he will be going by what the Dubai Municipality Engineer has said, and most often than not, it's correct. You know, he's not made it up. If, however, the witness is sitting in front of him and saying, I'm not responsible for it, that doesn't mean the Dubai Municipality Engineer is wrong. It just means that's not the individual who's responsible for that. It's for the prosecutor to find out who is responsible for the things that the engineer has said. We have had cases where there's been more than one Dubai Municipality Engineer, because of the duration of the case, give more than one report, and the reports say different things. And in those cases, like I said in the presentation, there is the opportunity for the court to call the engineer to the trial to give verbal evidence, or there is the opportunity for the public prosecutor to go off and have an interview with the engineer. And so he'll interview him and take him through his own report and say, you've said this, why did you say this? The witnesses say that's not true. And so there is a backwards and forwards process. Because I think the key thing to note, whilst all of this can be quite dramatic, there is a reason why these systems are in place, and we're trying to get to the bottom of why someone died or someone was injured. So The purpose of this is not to tell you how to evade liability and evade responsibility, because if an accident's happened, it's happened. But the job of the prosecutor is to actually do his job and find out who's most responsible for that, and the onus is on him to do that. Or you can happily sit there and say, I don't know, if you don't know.
Excuse me. Just wanted to ask you, in the legal framework, the documents, the validity of the documents, is there any validity on the documents? Suppose in this case, Ranjit was trained around 3 years back not to go to the phase 1 site. Is it still be valid document?
If he was trained 3 years back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just want to know what is on a legal framework, documents, validity. What is how many? 3 years, 5 years? Is there any period been set?
There is no set period, so there is no time frame where you'd say if it's 5 years old it's no good and if it's 3 years old it's fine. It's going to depend on the circumstances. Obviously the more recent the training, the better. You know, to use an extreme example, if you have a labourer that started 20 years ago and you only trained him on induction and haven't since, that's probably not going to be much help. So ideally you will have records that show that you have regularly trained individuals and that it's up to date, and that's going to be much stronger evidence than something that's perhaps out of date.
Because since the site is closed and there is no work, there is always a possibility that training must have been done long time back and there is no work at all, just a security guard sitting in the site. So if there is no need for a toolbox talk or any kind of training to be given to the worker where he is not supposed to be accessing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to depend on the circumstances. There isn't a piece of legislation that says you have to train at these intervals. It depends on the circumstances and what you're training on. Of course, it's always going to be better to have recent training records, but if there's a reason that training hasn't been provided, then perhaps that will give you some explanation. I suppose it's not just training, it's also policies and procedures. So you may have signage or policies that say you must never access areas that are closed. Hopefully in this scenario they didn't, but you would want to have signage at the entrance to these closed off areas saying no entry, etc. So it's not, training is one part of it, but there's obviously lots of other documentation that you would want to have and submit as part of the process. I think we will call that time now. Conscious that it's nearly lunchtime, or probably overdue for lunchtime. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention and for your questions. I hope it was helpful and gave you some insight into what a public prosecutor interview would be like. Thank you.